Hi, welcome to Album Soup, where we go through the various ingredients, influences, and sounds that shape a particular album. In this episode, we are talking about Alice Coltrane's Journey in Satchadananda. In my shorts leading up to this video, which are essentially the same content in bite-sized chunks, I referred to this as Alice Coltrane's rabbit hole, which I thought was kind of fun because, first of all, her name is Alice, and the idea of a rabbit hole comes from Alice in Wonderland, and second, because this album is a journey both titularly and figuratively, or thematically, I suppose, right? But I guess I gave some thought to the idea of a rabbit hole within the context of the internet and realized that's really not what I'm trying to do at all. There is nothing mysterious or dark or weird or bizarre about anything that I'm talking about. I just did a lot of research about Alice Coltrane's musical influences and I'm explaining them here. That's pretty much it. But then I realized that rabbit holes have a non-bizarre cousin in the iceberg, which is why I'm doing instead an iceberg of Alice Coltrane's influences. So without further ado, let's get into our first influence, John Coltrane. I think this one kind of speaks for itself. If you know anything about Alice Coltrane, you're certainly aware of John Coltrane too. They even share a last name because she was married to him. He was a huge influence on her music as well as basically every single jazz artist who came after him. He had an amazing career. He was a chameleon. He evolved so much over such a short period of time and died young and yet still put out an amazing amount of music. I think that it's fair he belongs in his own kind of category at the above the surface level of the iceberg because he's just so well known. He's the only person on this entire iceberg who I think is definitively easily more famous and well known than Alice Coltrane is, and her music never would have been what it was without his music, so he deserves that inclusion. And I'm going to recommend his album A Love Supreme, because this album is kind of the cornerstone of spiritual jazz, often hailed as one of the greatest jazz albums of all time, and it's deeply spiritual in theme. I mean, it's about God and divinity and love, and I think that this is all stuff that Alice Coltrane really spent the rest of her life embodying and preaching about, both musically and just in her religious stuff, which I'll explain a bit more about later. Pharoah Sanders. I think Pharoah Sanders is really the third leg of the Holy Jazz Trinity along with John and Alice Coltrane. He influenced John Coltrane, not just the other way around, which is significant in its own right. And after John Coltrane died, Pharoah Sanders really picked up the mantle. I think this album, Karma, probably his best known and one of his best on quality, really is like a sequel to A Love Supreme, and that's not an original thought. You can definitely hear the similarities in the compositions, but there's still plenty of originality in it. Plus, Pharoah Sanders is a super important part of Journey in Satchadananda. He is contributing the saxophone parts, which make the album so memorable. I mean, in addition to the other components, but the album would not be what it was without him, and he is a titan of spiritual jazz who had a fantastic career. Ravi Shankar. Ravi Shankar is probably the first non-obvious inclusion on this iceberg if you only know a little bit about Alice Coltrane. She and John named their son after him because of how important he was to them. Ravi Shankar was an Indian musician. He also popularized the sitar in the West. He taught George Harrison how to play, and I think he's easily the most famous Indian musician in the rest of the world for a very good reason. He makes really interesting music. This album, The Sounds of India, is the best place to start with him because he literally explains what's going on to the listener. I think this album is made for a Western audience, and that's not a bad thing because he's trying to get people to be more aware of Indian music and expose them to his culture, and I think it's done very well. I think this album is really cool, and I definitely think that Ravi Shankar and Indian music more generally, as we'll see getting deeper and deeper into this iceberg, are super important to Alice Coltrane's sound on the whole. McCoy Tyner. McCoy Tyner is a jazz piano great. He's still alive, if I'm not wrong, and he was part of John Coltrane's classic quartet. He played on A Love Supreme, but then he left the band not shortly thereafter, or not long thereafter, because he just kind of wasn't feeling the music. I don't think there was any hard feelings or anything, because he and Alice did collaborate later. I think that's really wonderful that he just accepted or realized that where John Coltrane was going wasn't a place that he was going to join him on, but then continued to do his own thing and do it very well. Plus, I think McCoy Tyner's piano playing is very spiritual, or at least has that kind of sonic feel for me. I think it's very shimmering and very mesmerizing and beautiful, a little bit like the impressionistic classical stuff. And the album of his I'm going to recommend is Extensions, because Alice Coltrane is on here on the harp. Charlie Haydon. Charlie Haydon plays bass on the final track of Journey in Satchadananda, the live track, Isis and Osiris. He is a really important figure in jazz bass playing and jazz on the whole that I don't know if really gets his due. He was the jazz player on The Shape of Jazz to Come, for example, and had an amazing solo career as well. He really pushed the avant-garde envelope, I think, but also was very willing to play more melodic and peaceful stuff. And this album really showcases that wide variety of jazz that he was capable of and interested in, because it's an album of duets, and he really meets the other player on their home footing. So with Alice Coltrane, there's a harp track. With Keith Jarrett, there is a beautiful piano and bass collaborative song, which sounds very much like Keith Jarrett's beautiful piano playing. And like with the Ornette Coleman song, you're getting what you expect if you have any familiarity with Ornette Coleman. So Charlie Haden really was a very versatile jazz bassist who definitely deserves more credit as like a devoted member of jazz history, and I'm happy to include him on this iceberg. Dorothy Ashby. I would say Dorothy Ashby is our first like internet music pick, perhaps. I don't know how well known she is now, and I don't think she was very well known in her time in the 60s, but she really was a trailblazer. I think she was kind of one of the few artists playing harp in jazz music, and she was a black woman. So I have so much respect for her for being, an individual and following her own artistic path. There was some, I guess, like hypothesizing that Alice Coltrane might have learned harp from her, although this doesn't appear to be true. I don't know who else Alice Coltrane has as like a predecessor in jazz harp to, like, other than Dorothy Ashby. The album of hers that I'm recommending, Afro Harping, is not actually super jazzy. It's kind of like space age, almost like lounge music type of stuff. It's still pretty cool, and from what I understand, she did mix it up on her different albums, so don't expect something purely jazz here, but I think it just showcases a wide, versatile player experimenting in different styles with an instrument that is often not appreciated for its full versatility. Nala Senefro. Okay, now I'm staying with another harpist once again. Nala Senefro, though, is a modern player. I mean, she just released her most recent album like last year, a score, I believe. She is one of my favorite young artists out there right now. She really does play piano and harp like Alice Coltrane did, but her music doesn't really sound like that. It's very electronic and ambient and spacey. Earfeeder called her post-spiritual jazz, and I think that name makes a lot of sense. I love her music. I think she's an amazing harpist and pianist, and I cannot recommend her enough if you're looking for harp in more modern contexts. Benny Maupin. Benny Maupin's legacy is not something I know that much about. Like, I don't know how well known he is. As someone who does know a lot about jazz, I did not hear about him for a long time, and that's a shame because he's so good. And The Jewel in the Lotus is an amazing spiritual jazz album with a lot of avant-garde and kind of experimental tendencies as well. I think there's a lot of focus on individual instruments. Plus, as I didn't even know until I started researching Alice Coltrane's life and music, but they were close friends. They knew each other in high school. They jammed together a lot when they were both pretty young. I think like before even she was married to John Coltrane. So they definitely kind of bounced ideas off of each other. And I think that this album, even if it doesn't sound specifically similar to Journey and Satchadananda, is still an amazing spiritual jazz album that everyone should check out if they're into this type of stuff. Detroit bebop pianists. I have a few artists to go through in this section, I suppose, because Alice Coltrane grew up in Detroit, and her music is very inspired and influenced by bebop, which is what she grew up playing. Detroit was really a booming jazz city back in the 50s, and a lot of them were people she actually knew and grew up with and learned from, and so I wanted to bring them up here. First up, Tommy Flanagan with the album Master Trio. He worked for Ella Fitzgerald and was a sideman for lots of other artists, but he made a lot of albums in his own right as a leader. He was influenced by the generation before him, I guess like pre-bop is what I like to call it, but he still is known as a big name in bebop, and this album's rhythm section is really tight as well. Ron Carter and Tony Williams on bass and drums. Next up, Barry Harris with Newer Than New. This guy was even closer to Alice Coltrane's family. I think he might have courted her older sister, and she described him as a musician of the highest order. Her brother, her half-brother, Ernie Farrow, who she was very close to and who influenced her a lot, also played bass on this album. I think that his early death was one of the most shocking and traumatic incidents for her in her young life, alongside John Coltrane dying. I don't know how far apart they were in time, but another really great jazz album to show the music that Alice Coltrane was steeped in before she went into this spiritual territory. Last up, Bud Powell with Inner Fires. Bud Powell was not actually from Detroit. I think he was from New York, although he and Alice became close when they were living in Paris, of all places, when she was there with her first husband. He had a troubled life, Bud Powell, but he was an amazing pianist, and this album, I think, is Worth choosing. One, because it has a wild and cool cover. Second of all, because Charles Mingus is the bass player on here, and Charles Mingus is my favorite musician of all time. His piano playing kind of has this manic and frantic energy to it. It's really, really good, but also there's something like at unease for me, at least. Like I do not relax to this type of stuff, but it's really good. Ali Akbar Khan. Ali Akbar Khan was a collaborator of Ravi Shankar, another musician known for popularizing Indian music in the West and the rest of the world. Though he played an instrument called the sarod, which is a little different than a sitar, also a string instrument, but something that I really enjoyed listening to on this album. Maybe it's because I have a background as a trombone player and a bass player, like a fretless bass player, and I like how smooth and these like glissandos can sound, and maybe that's just kind of what a sarod is meant to do. This album is also interesting for its inclusion of both northern and southern classical Indian music traditions, the Hindustani and Carnatic tradition. And I think that in terms of getting to know Alice Coltrane's Indian influences, this is another good place to look. Don Cherry. The more I learn about Don Cherry, the more interesting an artist he is. This album, Brown Rice or Don Cherry, I think it has two different names on two different reissues, is pretty much spiritual jazz, although it has some weird electronic influences too. I mean, good weird electronic influences. I think it's a really cool spiritual jazz album that doesn't really sound like anything else in the genre, and yet he got way deeper into like world music, a title that I hate, but he made music influenced by Asia and Africa a lot more and got into some avant-garde classical minimalist stuff later as well. Really interesting artist. I don't know that much about this like really experimental stuff of his, and something I'm going to look at more. One viewer of one of my shorts recommended the album Kadona, which is a trio that he has. It's very much Asian, Indian, African music. There's very little jazz in it, and that's not a bad thing at all. It's a really cool Eastern-inspired experimental album, and I think it showcases how versatile and open-minded Don Cherry was, so give it a check. Jazz inspired by the East. Once again, I'm going to talk about a couple of different projects in this one category. Alice Coltrane's music is obviously very inspired by the East, but some artists went kind of even further, or their acknowledgements towards India or Asia or Africa were even more explicit. One such artist is Yusuf Lateef with the album Eastern Sounds. He was another prominent member of the Detroit jazz scene when Alice was coming up, but he was one of the first artists to really move away from that and start fusing jazz with sounds and instruments from Asia and from Africa. And he got deeper and deeper into New Age as his career progressed, which I think is kind of a trajectory that a lot of these artists share, but he's definitely worth mentioning in this category. This album, Eastern Sound, still is definitely rooted in jazz, and it's worth listening to if you like this type of fusion. I also want to bring up Cecil McBee's album, Music from the Source. He was the bass player on most of Journey in Satchadananda, the first 4 studio tracks. I think his bass playing on this album is amazing, and I think Music from the Source is also amazing. I don't know exactly what the source is, but I suspect it's like Asia or Africa themed jazz music made by people like Duke Ellington or Dizzy Gillespie, because it sounds almost like that composition Caravan. And I mean, the desert cover art also kind of indicates that interpretation, but it doesn't just sound like rehashing these old styles. It does sound like they kind of introduce elements of their own era of jazz into it. There's some spiritual and some avant-garde jazz elements on this album, and I think it mixes together all really nicely, and I really like this album. Next up, I have another viewer recommendation, something I had never heard of, but I'm really glad I've heard now. Pat Martino with Baina, The Clear Evidence. This album is similar to the East Meets West formula of Alice Coltrane's music, the Journey in Satchadananda era music, but it's a guitar album. I'm not usually that into jazz guitar, truth be told, but I do think it's executed very well here, and I can appreciate that. Plus, from what I understand, it was him digging into the Quran. It's kind of like a musical exploration of the Quran, which is not something you'd expect to hear in jazz guitar. So it's a very interesting album, and I respect it quite a bit. Lemon Gospel Chorus. Gospel music isn't the easiest to find just as like an album on the internet, because I think a lot of it predates the album era. And yet I found this one album, Shield Me, O Lord, by Lucille Lemon and the Lemon Gospel Chorus, and I think that's as good an inclusion as I can get to the music that Alice Coltrane grew up listening to. That was her first real taste of music. She learned piano playing it in church, and so she learned how to kind of improvise and accompany from a very young age. I think probably a super important skill for jazz artists to have, other than just playing classical music where you're memorizing a a piece of music, not to belittle classical music at all, but I think improvisation is a whole different level of cognitive playing. Obviously, Alice Coltrane did not stick to gospel throughout her career and life, but I think that this spiritual component of music, which is something that she clearly had at the very beginning, is something that stayed with her forever. And so I cannot in any way understate how important gospel music like this was to her development. M.S. Subbulakshmi. So this suggestion is actually less based on Journey in Satchadananda and more based on the type of Indian music that Alice Coltrane would pursue later in her career when she was the guru at an ashram in Malibu. You heard me right, and look it up if you find that interesting. But she got really into bhajan, which is like a Hindu devotional chanting type of music. And this artist, M.S. Subbulakshmi, is kind of the queen of that from what I understand. I think she's really renowned in India. This is not a tradition I know very much about, but she does seem very important. And the album Vishnu Saharasnamam, I hope I got that right, is what I can imagine to be a pretty good example of this type of this type of chanting. It's very minimalist. It's very much based on the voice, and I think you can really hear the spiritual devotion in it, even if you have no idea what the words mean. La Monte Young. I cannot believe I haven't brought up the tambura yet, but the tambura is an Indian string instrument that produces a really drony sound. I would say this is probably much more important to Journey and Satchadananda's sound than any sitar or sarod or other string instrument would. The tambura really became a signature sound for Alice Coltrane, and it's a sound I love. And someone else who loved it was La Monte Young and his partner Marian Zazila, who are huge names in drone music, pioneers as a matter of fact. They were inspired by Pandit Pranath, a real deal monk guru type guy from India, to make drone music using this one instrument. And this long recording, it's over an hour. I mean, it's drone. What do you expect? Is two tamburas, one played on each channel. It's a really textbook example of drone music, and it's cool to hear how the Indian music popularity or scene, I guess, in the 60s wasn't restricted to popular music with like George Harrison. The avant-garde artists were also just as interested in Indian music. And I think that's really cool to hear how different sides of American or English or Western music appreciated and incorporated Indian elements. Diana Ross. Did you expect Diana Ross and Alice Coltrane to collaborate? Well, they didn't. But Alice's sister, Marilyn McLeod, wrote that song Love Hangover, which is a disco epic off of this album, Diana Ross. And I don't necessarily know how much either of, like, if Diana or Alice knew of each other or listened to each other or anything like that. But I think it's just a testament to the variety of music that Black people in Detroit were producing in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, how cool it was, how multivariate it was. Alice came from a very musical family, and her sister made some really cool music, even if it was an entirely different channel than what Alice was doing. Sun. I don't know if I could pick two albums that superficially sound any more different than Monoliths and Dimensions and Journey and Satchadananda, but Sun, who are drone metal giants, were clearly inspired enough by Alice Coltrane to name the final track on this album after her. I guess you could kind of think of it as drone music coming full circle because two opposite sides of the spectrum, one that's mostly harmonious and one that's largely like noise and somewhat abrasion based, are managing to meet, and that's pretty interesting. So that is it for the Alice Coltrane Iceberg. Truth be told, this is kind of an abridged version of my album guide that you can find on Instagram or TikTok in a visual form. I hope that this was interesting and informative if you like Alice Coltrane. There are so many great spiritual jazz and just jazz albums generally that kind of slip through the cracks. Like, it's totally a crate diggers type of genre if you ask me, and I love finding out about more deep cuts that I had never heard of because it's a genre that you can like continue to find deep cuts even if you're very familiar with it. So give some in the comments if you have any, or any other albums or anything else that you want to talk about. I'd love to hear it. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.